There's something haunting about the last meal you share with someone you thought you knew. The details become etched in your mind, how the light flickered just right, the faint scent of something burnt mixed with a hint of rosemary, and the way your wife's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. I remember the clink of forks against ceramic plates, the casual conversation about nothing and everything, school updates from our son, Liam, complaints about work from me, and her, quietly nodding, her responses rehearsed, as if she were trying too hard to be normal. I should have seen it then, the tension tucked neatly beneath her calm exterior. But hindsight's a cruel teacher. The night started like any other. Emma had made spaghetti, her special recipe, as she called it, the one with the thick, rich sauce she knew Liam and I loved. She even poured me a glass of red wine, which wasn't typical for a random Wednesday. I chalked it up to her being in a good mood, or maybe trying to smooth over the growing distance between us. Marriage has its ebbs and flows, right? I never expected poison to be one of them. I took the first bite, savoring the familiar flavors, though something felt off. Not in taste, exactly, just a whisper of bitterness beneath the tang of tomatoes and garlic. But I brushed it aside. Maybe she'd tried something new. Liam scarfed his down like any 12-year-old would, oblivious to the subtle shift in the air. It hit me fast. Too fast. One moment I was reaching for my glass, the next my vision blurred. My muscles felt like they'd turned to lead, and my heart raced erratically in my chest. I tried to stand, but my legs buckled. Across the table, Liam's fork clattered to the floor. He looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, his mouth trying to form words that never came. And then he collapsed. Panic surged through me, stronger than the poison invading my system. But even in that chaos, a part of me, the part that refused to die without answers, fought back. I realized something wasn't right beyond the obvious. Emma wasn't panicking. She didn't scream or rush to our sides. She just stood there, her expression blank. That's when I knew. She did this. With the last shred of control I had, I forced my body to go limp, slowing my breathing to the bare minimum, pretending to lose consciousness. It was a gamble. If she checked my pulse, she'd know. But Emma had already decided we were dead. Through the haze, I heard her footsteps as she moved around the table. I felt her hover over me, her breath warm against my ear. Then, softly, like she was confessing a secret to a corpse, she whispered, "Finally!" I wanted to scream, to reach out and grab her, to demand why. But I stayed still. My mind raced, piecing together every interaction, every argument, every cold glance over the past year. There had been signs, I'd just been too blind to see them. She didn't check on Liam. She didn't even flinch. Instead, I heard her walking away, her footsteps fading down the hall. A door creaked open, then closed softly. I waited. Counted to 100 in my head, even though each second felt like an eternity. My body screamed in protest as I forced my eyes open just a sliver. The room spun, but I could make out Liam's small, unmoving body on the floor. A ragged sob threatened to escape my throat, but I swallowed it down. I couldn't afford grief, not yet. I crawled to him, every movement agony. His face was pale, his lips tinged blue, but there was the faintest rise and fall of his chest. He was still alive. Barely. Adrenaline can be a powerful antidote to fear. Somehow, I dragged us both to the car. I don't remember how I managed to drive, how I didn't black out completely. The hospital lights blurred into one continuous beam as I staggered in with Liam cradled in my arms. Poison, they said. Fast-acting. Fatal if untreated. But we made it. While the doctors worked on Liam, I lay in a hospital bed, hooked up to IVs, my mind not on recovery but on Emma. The woman I loved. The woman who tried to kill me. And she thought I was dead. That's when I made my decision. I'd pretend to stay dead. I needed to know why. I needed to understand how the woman I shared my life with became my would-be murderer. I needed the truth. And I'd get it, even if it killed me. They say surviving near death changes you. That's true, but not in the way you might think. It doesn't make you grateful or wiser, not immediately anyway. No, at first it makes you colder. Sharper. Like a blade that's been tempered in fire. And as I lay in that sterile hospital bed, my veins pumping with antidotes and 4 fluids, all I could think about was her. Emma. My wife. My would-be killer. I stared at the cracked ceiling tiles, the fluorescent lights humming softly, my mind replaying every detail of that night like a broken film reel. Her voice still echoed in my ears. Finally! I should have been heartbroken. Maybe I was, somewhere deep beneath the layers of shock and adrenaline. But heartbreak was for later. Now? I needed answers. I needed revenge. The plan formed in the stillness between beeping monitors and whispered nurse conversations. The doctor said it was a miracle Liam and I survived. The toxin had been lethal, fast-acting, designed to shut down the nervous system within minutes. If we'd arrived even 15 minutes later, we'd have been beyond saving. They asked questions, of course. The police came. But I said nothing. Not yet. Not until I had more. I convinced the hospital to keep my condition under wraps. Said I didn't want to alarm any family members. Technically true. The less Emma knew, the better. As far as she was concerned, I was dead, or would be soon enough. 3 days later, I signed myself out against medical advice. Liam stayed under care, stable but unconscious. The poison had taken a heavier toll on his smaller body, and that guilt was an anchor I carried with me, heavier than any betrayal. But I couldn't stay. Not yet. I had to face her. I couldn't go home, though. That house wasn't safe. Not for me, and not for the truth. Instead, I found myself in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where people disappear without questions. I stared into the cracked bathroom mirror, my reflection a stranger, pale skin, sunken eyes, a man hollowed out by betrayal. I'd kept one thing with me from the house, a key. Not to our front door, but to the small lockbox I'd hidden in the garage years ago, tucked behind dusty shelves of forgotten tools. It contained something I never thought I'd need again, an old burner phone, cash, and a small pistol I'd inherited from my father. I didn't plan on killing her. Not yet. I needed the truth first. The whole, ugly truth. The first night alone was the hardest. Sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Liam's body on the floor, saw Emma's shadow disappearing down the hall. I didn't eat. Couldn't. The memory of that poisoned dinner was enough to turn my stomach. By morning, I was ready. I drove past the house twice before I had the nerve to park down the street. It looked the same. Normal. The porch light was on, even though it was broad daylight. Emma's car sat in the driveway, spotless as always. Through the binoculars I'd picked up from a thrift store, I watched. She moved through the house like nothing had happened. No grief. No signs of loss. She watered the plants. Took out the trash. She even laughed on the phone, her head tilted back, her hair catching the sunlight like it used to when we first met. I felt something twist inside me, not love. Not anymore. But something colder. That's when he showed up. I didn't recognize him at first. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed too casually for a business call. He didn't knock. Just walked right in with his own key. A key. My grip tightened around the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. So that's how it was. I stayed there for hours, watching. They never left the house. The lights flickered on as evening settled, shadows moving behind the curtains. I didn't need to see the details. I knew. It wasn't just about killing me. It was about replacing me. That realization burned hotter than the poison ever had. By the 3rd day of surveillance, I had a routine. I tracked her movements, his visits. He never stayed the night, not yet. But he was there often enough to make it clear. This wasn't new. This had been going on long before the poison. I snapped photos, recorded timestamps. Evidence. Then, on the 4th day, something changed. Emma left the house late, dressed to impress, her makeup flawless, her hair perfectly styled. not the look of a grieving widow. She met him at a small cafe downtown. They sat close, heads tilted together, hands brushing like teenagers in love. I positioned myself where I could hear pieces of their conversation, the words slipping through the gaps in the outdoor seating area. "He's gone. Finally. We don't have to pretend anymore," Emma whispered, her fingers grazing his hand. He chuckled, low and confident. "Took longer than I thought. I was starting to think you'd lost your nerve." She smiled. That same smile she used to give me. "I told you I'd handle it." I didn't hear the rest. I didn't need to. I knew enough. But not everything. Not yet. I slipped away unnoticed, my mind racing with the next step. I couldn't confront her, not until I had every piece of the puzzle. This wasn't just about infidelity. It was something more. And I was going to find out exactly what. Even if it killed me, revenge is a patient man's game. It thrives in the shadows, feeding on silence and observation. That's what I told myself as I sat in the dim light of the motel room, the cheap lamp casting flickering halos against the peeling wallpaper. The air smelled faintly of mildew and stale cigarettes, but it was safer here, away from the house, away from her. Emma thought I was dead. That gave me an advantage. She had lowered her guard, peeling back layers of deceit she had carefully crafted over the years. But as much as I wanted to storm into that house and demand answers, I knew better. People lie when they're cornered. They reveal the truth when they think no one is listening. So I listened. I spent my days tracking her routine, blending into the background like a ghost. She was meticulous, always polished, always perfect. But perfection is a fragile thing, and Emma's cracks were starting to show. On the 5th day after my so-called death, I followed her to an office building downtown. Not her usual routine. She claimed to be a freelance consultant, worked from home mostly, or so she'd said. But she walked into that sleek glass building like she belonged, her heels clicking confidently against the polished floors. I waited across the street, parked in a borrowed car, a dusty old sedan I'd picked up from a friend who owed me a favor, no questions asked. Through the tinted windows, I watched and waited. 2 hours passed. Then 3. When she finally emerged, she wasn't alone. The man was with her again. The same one from the house. Tall, sharp-featured, with a grin that stretched too wide. They didn't hold hands, but their body language screamed intimacy, shoulders brushing, heads tilted close, laughter spilling into the night air like a private joke. I followed them. Not home. Not this time. They drove to a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town, the kind where the houses are too perfect, the lawns too neatly trimmed. They parked in front of a modest 2-story house, nothing remarkable, except for the fact that Emma had never mentioned it. I killed the car's engine and watched from a distance as they went inside. No hesitation. No need to sneak around. This wasn't an affair hidden in the shadows. This was something deeper. Hours passed. My mind raced with possibilities. Another house? Another life? By the time the lights went out, my curiosity had morphed into something darker. I needed answers, and waiting wasn't an option anymore. I approached the house cautiously, sticking to the shadows, every step calculated. The place was quiet, the kind of silence that makes your own heartbeat sound deafening. I circled around to the back, where a small window glowed faintly. I peered inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. Not them, not Emma or the man. Documents. Stacks of papers sprawled across the kitchen table, illuminated by the faint glow of a single lamp left on. I couldn't make out the details from where I stood, but the words, insurance policy, and beneficiary, were clear enough. Insurance policy. It hit me like a punch to the chest. I had a life insurance policy. A hefty one, enough to secure Liam's future if anything ever happened to me. But that policy had been untouched for years. Emma insisted we keep it as a safety net. Just in case. Apparently, she'd decided to cash in. I clenched my fists, my breath ragged. But emotions wouldn't get me answers. Not yet. I needed proof, solid, undeniable evidence. The next day, I visited an old friend, Detective Mark Hill. We'd gone to college together before life took us down different roads. I knew he'd ask questions, but I also knew he'd keep his mouth shut if I framed it right. I met him in a quiet diner on the edge of town, the kind where people mind their own business. "Mark," I greeted him, sliding into the booth across from him. He looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Jesus, you look like hell." "Been through it," I replied flatly. He didn't press. Just sipped his coffee and waited. "I need a favor," I continued. "Off the record." Mark arched an eyebrow. "You're supposed to be dead, aren't you?" I didn't flinch. "Not dead enough." He leaned back, studying me for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Tell me everything." I laid it out: the dinner, the collapse, the hospital, Emma's lover, the insurance policy. I didn't hold back. Mark listened without interruption, his face unreadable. When I finished, he tapped his fingers against his coffee cup thoughtfully. "You need evidence," he said finally. "Real evidence. Not just your word." "I know. I can run a background check on the guy," Mark offered. "See what comes up." It was a start. Over the next few days, Mark dug into the man's identity. His name was Tyler Green. No criminal record, but his financials were messy: debts, failed business ventures, lawsuits. The kind of man who'd find a hefty insurance payout very appealing. Meanwhile, I kept watching. I tracked Emma's movements, photographed meetings, documented timelines. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, but one thing still didn't make sense. Why now? Emma had been patient, careful. Why risk everything now? The answer came on a rainy Thursday evening. I followed her to a lawyer's office. She didn't go in alone. Tyler was with her, and they weren't discussing legal contracts. They were finalizing something. I waited until they left, then approached the office. The door was locked, but luck, or fate, was on my side. The cleaning crew was just finishing up. I slipped inside unnoticed, heart pounding, and found what I was looking for. Divorce papers. Filed under my name. Signed. But I never signed them. My signature was forged. It wasn't just murder. It was erasure. Emma wasn't trying to leave me. She was trying to rewrite me out of existence. And she almost succeeded. Almost thought I stared at the divorce papers like they were written in a language I couldn't understand. My name was there, bold and final at the bottom of the page, my signature. But it wasn't mine. It was a ghost of my handwriting, a perfect imitation crafted by someone who had studied me closely. Someone who knew how I dotted my I's and the subtle curve at the tail of my "Why?" Emma. She hadn't just tried to kill me. She'd planned to erase me. I tucked the papers into my jacket and left the lawyer's office as quietly as I had entered. The rain outside had turned into a steady drizzle, the streets slick with reflections of neon signs and traffic lights. The world moved on as if nothing had changed. But for me, everything had. Back at the motel, I spread out the evidence on the chipped wooden desk: photos of Emma and Tyler, the forged divorce papers, notes from Mark's investigation. A dark mosaic of betrayal. But it still wasn't enough. I needed more than just fragments. I needed the whole picture. Mark called later that night. His voice was low, cautious. "I dug deeper into Tyler Green," he said. "He's bad news. Bankruptcies, shady business dealings, and, get this, he's been involved in 2 insurance claims in the past 5 years. Both his exes? Dead under suspicious circumstances. Nothing ever stuck, but it's a pattern." I gripped the phone tighter. "And Emma? She's not as clean as you thought. Before she met you, she had a different name, Emma Reed. Changed it after a messy legal case involving fraud. Charges were dropped, but her boyfriend at the time disappeared without a trace." My stomach turned. I'd married a stranger. The woman I loved, the mother of my son, wasn't real. She was a mask, a carefully constructed persona built on lies. And I had fallen for it completely. I spent the next day reviewing everything, trying to find the crack in their plan. Emma was smart, too smart to leave a trail unless she was confident no one would be around to follow it. But people get sloppy when they think they've won. That's when I remembered the key. Not the house key. The small, brass key Emma kept on her keychain, the one she claimed was for a safety deposit box she never used. I'd seen it 1,000 times, dangling beside the car key, insignificant and forgotten. But nothing Emma did was insignificant. I followed her the next morning, keeping my distance as she went about her routine. Grocery store. Gym. Then the bank. She didn't go to the teller. Instead, she headed straight to the back, disappearing behind a frosted glass door labeled Private Access. I parked across the street, heart pounding. After she left, I went in. The clerk barely looked up when I approached. "I need to access my wife's safety deposit box," I said, forcing a casual smile. "She's asked me to pick something up." The clerk glanced at me, then at the computer screen. "Name?" I gave Emma's full name. She tapped on the keyboard, then frowned. "I'm sorry, sir. Only authorized individuals can access the box." I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice. "Look, I'm not trying to cause trouble. But it's urgent. Family matter." I slid a folded bill across the counter, a small bribe to grease the wheels. She hesitated, then sighed. "Fine. But you didn't get this from me." She led me to the vault, unlocking the box with a key identical to the one Emma carried. Inside was a manila envelope. No jewelry. No family heirlooms. Just paperwork. I waited until I was back in the motel to open it. Inside were documents that made my blood run cold. Fake IDs, one for Emma, one for Tyler, under different names. A plane ticket to a country with no extradition treaty. Bank statements showing large transfers to offshore accounts. And at the bottom, a death certificate. My death certificate. Dated for the day after Emma tried to kill me. She had planned everything down to the last detail. My death wasn't just an accident or a crime of passion. It was a business transaction, a meticulous operation designed to eliminate me and cash in. But she made one mistake. I was still alive. I called Mark. "I've got enough. I'm going to her." "Don't be stupid," he snapped. "You're not thinking straight." "I'm thinking clearer than I ever have," I replied, my voice cold. "I want her to see me. I want her to know she failed." I hung up before he could argue. That night I went home. I parked down the street, my heart pounding like a war drum. The house looked the same, lights glowing warmly, curtains drawn, the faint outline of someone moving inside. I approached quietly, slipping through the shadows until I reached the back door. The spare key was still hidden under the potted plant, exactly where I'd left it months ago. The lock clicked softly as I turned the key. The house smelled like lemon cleaner and betrayal. I moved silently through the dark, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Voices drifted from the living room, Emma's soft laugh and Tyler's low murmur. I stood in the doorway, watching them. Emma sat curled up on the couch, a glass of wine in her hand, her head resting on Tyler's shoulder. She looked relaxed. Happy. Like she had won. I stepped into the light. She didn't see me at first. But Tyler did. His eyes widened, his face draining of color. Emma followed his gaze, turning slowly. When her eyes met mine, the wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor. She didn't scream. She just whispered one word, her voice trembling. No. But yes. I was alive. And I was here to finish what she started. For the first time since that cursed dinner, it was my turn to watch her face drain of color. Emma sat frozen on the couch, her wide eyes locked on me, disbelief etched into every line of her perfect face. Tyler shifted beside her, tense, like a cornered animal ready to lash out. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, trying to process the impossible. The man they thought was dead standing in the doorway, alive, breathing, and very much aware. I didn't speak. Not yet. I wanted the silence to suffocate them the way their betrayal had suffocated me. I wanted the weight of my presence to be heavier than any words. Emma was the first to move. She stood slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she brushed non-existent dust from her dress, a nervous habit I'd seen 100 times before. "Jason," she breathed, her voice barely more than a whisper. I didn't respond. I just stared, letting her sit in the tension, letting it wrap around her like a noose. Tyler recovered faster than she did. He stood abruptly, his bravado kicking in to cover the fear simmering beneath. This is impossible," he stammered, his jaw tightening as he tried to regain control. "Surprise?" I finally said, my voice low and steady. Emma took a shaky step toward me, her expression shifting from shock to something else, concern. The same faux concern she used when she'd lie about late meetings or unexplained absences. How are you here?" she asked, her voice dripping with forced softness. "Jason, we thought you died?" I finished for her, my lips curling into a bitter smile. "Yeah, I noticed." She swallowed hard, glancing at Tyler, who was inching slightly to the side, like he was positioning himself between me and the front door. His movements were subtle, but not subtle enough. I reached into my jacket, pulling out the manila envelope, the one from the safety deposit box. I tossed it onto the coffee table between us. The papers spilled out like spilled guts, fake IDs, offshore bank statements, forged documents. My death certificate. Emma's face twisted into something between rage and panic. Tyler's mask of confidence cracked completely. "You were planning to disappear," I said, stepping closer. "New names, new life. All you needed was for me to die quietly. But you got sloppy." Tyler snapped. "You need to leave," he barked, his voice brittle. "You're trespassing." I laughed, sharp and cold. Trespassing? In my own house? I took another step, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You tried to kill me. Both of you." Emma's facade shattered. The mask of innocence slipped, revealing the cold calculation underneath. "You were supposed to die," she hissed, her voice low, venomous. "It would have been easier if you had." There it was, the truth. I nodded slowly, absorbing her words like a final nail in the coffin of who we used to be. Tyler moved first, lunging toward me with a burst of desperate energy. But he was sloppy, fueled by adrenaline and fear. I stepped aside, grabbing his arm and using his own momentum to slam him into the wall. He crumpled to the floor, groaning in pain. Emma didn't scream. She just stood there, breathing heavily, her eyes dark and furious. "I loved you," I said quietly, staring down at her. "I built a life with you. A family. And you threw it away for him?" I glanced at Tyler, who was struggling to get back on his feet. Emma's lips curled into a sneer. "You were a means to an end, Jason. That's all. A paycheck with a pulse." The words hit harder than any punch. I stepped back, shaking my head. "You're a monster." Her smile was razor sharp. "No, Jason. I'm a survivor. And you should have stayed dead." Tyler lunged again, this time with more rage than sense. But I was ready. I met him head-on, my fist connecting with his jaw. He hit the floor with a sickening thud, unconscious. Emma didn't flinch. She just stared at me, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. "What now?" she asked, her voice almost curious. "You going to kill me? Is that your big plan?" I stepped closer until we were inches apart. "No," I whispered. "I'm going to let the truth kill you." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small recording device I'd been carrying. I hit stop and held it up so she could see the blinking light. Her face paled. "Confession's a powerful thing," I said quietly. She lunged at me, her nails clawing at my face, but I was faster. I grabbed her wrists, twisting them behind her back as she screamed and thrashed. Mark burst through the door seconds later, gun drawn. He took one look at the scene, Tyler unconscious on the floor, me pinning Emma, and holstered his weapon. "Got everything?" he asked, nodding toward the recorder. I nodded. Mark cuffed Emma, reading her rights as she spit curses at me, her face twisted in rage. As they dragged her out, she turned back one last time. Her eyes met mine, filled with hate. "This isn't over," she snarled. But it was. At least for her. The house was quiet after they took Emma away. Tyler was slumped on the living room floor, groaning softly as paramedics strapped him onto a stretcher. His face was swollen from the punch, his jaw likely fractured. I watched them load him into the ambulance, emotionless. He was nothing more than a shadow of the life I thought I had, a parasite who latched onto my wife, feeding on her greed and deceit. But Emma was different. The last thing she said before Mark shoved her into the police car echoed in my head. "This isn't over." She was right. Because even though the handcuffs were locked around her wrists, and her carefully constructed life had crumbled, the damage she'd done couldn't be undone with a simple arrest. She'd already poisoned me, just not in the way she intended. The house felt colder than it should have. Sterile, like a crime scene, which, I guess it was now. The walls held secrets I didn't want to hear anymore. The family photos on the mantel mocked me, each frozen smile a reminder of the lie I'd been living. I found myself standing in the kitchen, staring at the table where it all began, the dinner that nearly ended my life. The plates were gone, the evidence cleaned, but the memory remained vivid. I could still taste the bitterness in that last bite, not just from the poison but from the betrayal baked into every ingredient. Mark returned a few hours later after booking Emma. He didn't say much, just handed me the recorder and a small evidence bag. Inside was my wedding ring. I'd taken it off the night I left the hospital, unsure if I'd ever want to wear it again. Seeing it now felt surreal, like it belonged to someone else. "She's not saying much," Mark muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "Lawyered up fast." "Of course she did," I replied, pocketing the ring without looking at it again. Mark hesitated before speaking. "You know, most guys would have walked away. Let the cops handle it. But you wanted to see her break." I didn't respond because he was right. It wasn't enough to know she'd betrayed me. I needed to witness it, to hear her say it, to watch her mask slip, to feel the satisfaction of knowing she couldn't lie her way out. But it didn't feel like satisfaction now. It felt hollow. "I'll keep you updated," Mark said before leaving, his footsteps fading into the silence that swallowed the house once more. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in Liam's room. The walls were covered with posters of his favorite superheroes, drawings he'd made in school, little trophies from soccer games I'd never missed, until now. His bed was neatly made, untouched since the night of the poisoning. I stared at his pillow, thinking about the son I almost lost. This isn't over. Emma's words haunted me because she wasn't entirely wrong. Even with her gone, the damage lingered. Liam was still in the hospital, fighting to recover from the poison meant for me. And no matter how much I tried to piece my life back together, the cracks would always show. The next morning, I visited the hospital. Liam was awake but weak. His small body seemed even smaller against the crisp white sheets. When he saw me, his eyes lit up, a flicker of the life I thought I'd lost. "Dad?" His voice was raspy, but it was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. I sat beside him, gripping his hand gently. "Hey, buddy. I'm right here." His eyes fluttered shut briefly, tears slipping down his cheeks. I was scared. "Me too," I whispered, swallowing the lump in my throat. "But we're okay now." It wasn't entirely true. But it was what he needed to hear. For the next few days, I stayed with Liam, pretending everything was fine while the reality of my shattered life gnawed at the edges of my mind. Then the call came. Mark's voice was tense. "Jason, we've got a problem." I stepped into the hallway, my heart pounding. "What is it?" "She's gone." I gripped the phone tighter. "Gone? What do you mean gone?" "She escaped during a transport. They were moving her to a high-security facility, and there was an ambush. It was organized, planned." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Jason, I think Tyler had connections we didn't know about. This wasn't just about the insurance money. There's more to this." My mind raced. Emma's gone. And I knew exactly what she'd do next. She was coming for me. The sterile walls of the hospital seemed to close in on me as Mark's words echoed through the phone. She's gone. I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out the faint beeping of Liam's heart monitor behind me. I turned to look at him, his fragile body hooked up to machines that were the only thing keeping him safe, for now. She won't come here, I muttered, trying to convince myself more than Mark. She wouldn't risk it. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew I was lying. Emma was more dangerous now than ever. She had nothing left to lose. A cornered predator doesn't retreat. It strikes. Jason. Mark's voice cut through my thoughts, sharp and urgent. You need to get out of there. Now. I glanced at Liam, his small chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Leave? That wasn't an option. She's not getting near him, I said firmly. Not while I'm breathing. Mark sighed heavily on the other end. I'm sending an officer to the hospital. Keep your phone close. Don't trust anyone. I hung up and locked the door to Liam's room, pulling the blinds shut. My mind raced, calculating every possible angle. Emma was smart, smarter than me in many ways. She wouldn't make the same mistakes twice. She'd be patient, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But this time, I was ready. I spent the night sitting in the chair beside Liam's bed, my hand resting on the small pistol Mark had given me earlier, just in case, he'd said. I hated the weight of it, but the reality was clear. This wasn't over until one of us was dead. As the hours dragged on, exhaustion clawed at me, but I couldn't afford to close my eyes. Every shadow felt like it was watching me, every creak of the hospital floor a threat. By morning, Mark arrived with 2 uniformed officers. They posted one outside Liam's room and another at the entrance to the pediatric ward. She's not going to try anything here, Mark assured me, though his tense jaw said otherwise. I don't care, I snapped. We're not underestimating her again. Mark nodded. Fair enough. We reviewed the details of Emma's escape. The transport van had been ambushed by 2 armed men posing as construction workers near an overpass. They'd executed the guards with military precision, headshots, no hesitation. Emma vanished into the chaos, leaving no trace. She planned this, Mark said grimly. This wasn't some impulsive breakout. It was coordinated. Which meant she'd had help. Tyler's connections, I thought. I spent the next few days in a haze, juggling fear, anger, and exhaustion. I barely left Liam's side. But on the 4th night, something happened that snapped me back into full alertness. A note. It was slipped under the door while I dozed off for just a few minutes. No envelope. No signature. Just a piece of paper with one line scrawled in Emma's handwriting. You can't protect him forever. My heart clenched, and a surge of adrenaline shot through me. I burst into the hallway, gun drawn, but the corridor was empty. The officer outside Liam's door was slumped against the wall, unconscious, a small injection mark on his neck. She'd been here. She was that close. Mark arrived within minutes after my frantic call, his face pale with disbelief as he examined the unconscious officer. She's playing with you, he muttered. She wants you scared. Well, it's working, I snapped, my voice shaking with rage. We reviewed the security footage, but it had been wiped clean between 2 o'clock and 2:15 a.m., the exact window when the note appeared. She's got help, Mark growled. Someone on the inside. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Mark and I made a decision. We couldn't keep Liam in the hospital. It was too exposed. Too vulnerable. We arranged for a private medical team and moved him to a safe house. One of Mark's contacts owed him a favor, a secluded cabin about an hour outside the city. No neighbors, no cameras, no easy access. But as we packed Liam's things, I found another note tucked into his blanket. Running won't save him. My hands trembled as I crushed the note, rage boiling beneath the fear. She wasn't going to stop. Not until one of us was dead. We arrived at the safe house just before dusk. The cabin was small, hidden among dense trees, with only a narrow gravel road leading in. Mark secured the perimeter, setting up cameras and motion sensors. "This is as safe as it gets," he said quietly. But safety was an illusion, and Emma had already proven she could shatter illusions with ease. That night, as I sat beside Liam's bed, I thought about the woman I married, the woman who once whispered promises in the dark, who held my hand when Liam was born, who smiled at me like I was her entire world. Was any of it real? Or had I always been a target? The next morning, I woke to the sound of shattered glass. I grabbed my gun and rushed to the living room. The front window was smashed, a brick lying on the floor. Attached to it was another note, smeared with blood. "I'm closer than you think." Mark burst through the door seconds later, gun drawn. "She's here," I whispered. And this time, I wasn't waiting for her to make the first move. It was time to end this. The blood-smeared note stared back at me, its words etched into my mind like a brand. "I'm closer than you think." The letters were jagged, almost carved into the paper as if the pen itself had been gripped with rage. But it wasn't the message that made my hands tremble, it was the blood. Fresh. Real. She was here. Mark burst into the room seconds after me, his gun drawn, eyes scanning the broken window. The cool morning air seeped through the shattered glass, carrying with it the faint scent of pine mixed with something metallic. "Blood. She's playing with us," Mark growled, his voice low. "Trying to get into your head." "She's already there," I thought but didn't say it. We moved quickly. Mark secured the perimeter while I checked on Liam. He was still asleep, his chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. I brushed his hair back, my fingers trembling as I whispered, "I've got you, buddy. She's not getting near you." But the fear was like acid in my veins. I rejoined Mark outside. The gravel driveway was empty, no tire tracks, no footprints. But on the edge of the woods, about 50 feet from the cabin, we found it, a trail of blood drops leading deeper into the trees. "She's injured," Mark muttered. "Could be from the escape. Or maybe she's trying to bait us." I didn't care. Bait or not, I was done hiding. We followed the trail in silence, the dense woods swallowing us whole. The morning light filtered through the thick canopy, casting long shadows that danced with every gust of wind. My grip on the pistol tightened with every step, my heartbeat sinking with the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. After about a mile, we found it, a small clearing with an old hunting shed, the door slightly ajar. Mark signaled for me to flank the side while he approached the front, his gun steady. I moved quietly, every nerve in my body screaming, every muscle coiled like a spring. Mark kicked the door open, and I swung around the side, gun raised. Empty. But it wasn't abandoned. Inside, the walls were lined with newspaper clippings, articles about my company, our family vacations, even Liam's soccer games. Photos of us, taken from a distance, were pinned with surgical precision. And in the center of the room, a single Polaroid sat on an old wooden table. It was a picture of Liam. Sleeping. Taken last night. I staggered back, bow rising in my throat. She'd been in the cabin. While we were there. While I was sleeping right beside him. "She's watching us," Mark muttered, his face pale. "She's close." I spun around, scanning the trees, expecting her to step out, gun raised, that twisted smile on her face. But the woods were silent. We didn't speak as we rushed back to the cabin, dread gnawing at my insides. I burst through the door, heart pounding. Liam was gone. The bed was empty. The blankets tossed aside. A note was pinned to the pillow. "Come find us." I don't remember how long I stood there, staring at those words. Mark's voice was distant, muffled by the roar of panic in my ears. He was calling for backup, shouting coordinates, but all I could focus on was the emptiness of that bed. She had him. The fear was paralyzing, but beneath it was something darker, rage. The kind of rage that doesn't simmer. It burns. "We're going after her," I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. Mark hesitated. Jason. I'm not waiting for the cops. We're going now. We packed quickly. Weapons, flashlights, maps of the surrounding area. Mark managed to hack into the motion sensors he'd set up around the property. One camera caught a blurry figure carrying something small, Liam, heading north into the woods. She knew those woods better than us. She'd planned this. But I knew her. We tracked them for hours, the trail winding through dense trees, across shallow streams, up rocky hillsides. The occasional drop of blood marked the path, hers or Liam's, I didn't know. By dusk, we found another clue. Liam's favorite stuffed dinosaur, Rex, lying in the dirt, its fabric stained with blood. I dropped to my knees, clutching it like it was a lifeline. He's alive, Mark said quietly. She's leaving a trail. She wants you to follow. Good. Because I was going to find her. We kept moving, our flashlights cutting through the darkness as night fell. The woods were alive with sounds, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, but every noise felt like a threat. Then we heard it. A child's voice. Faint. Weak. Dad? I bolted toward the sound, Mark on my heels. We found a small cave hidden beneath an outcrop of rocks. Inside, the flicker of a lantern cast long shadows on the damp walls. And there she was. Emma. She stood with a gun pressed against Liam's temple, her face wild, eyes gleaming with a mix of triumph and madness. Hello, Jason, she purred, her voice smooth as silk. Miss me? My heart stopped. Let him go, I growled, my gun aimed at her head. She laughed. Laughed. Like this was all a game. Oh, Jason, this was never about letting go. It's about control. Mark moved to the side, trying to get a clear shot, but Emma noticed. Don't, she snapped, her finger tightening on the trigger. Liam whimpered, tears streaking his dirty face. I took a shaky breath, lowering my gun slightly. Emma, listen to me. This isn't you. She tilted her head, amused. Isn't it? You never really knew me, Jason. You loved the idea of me. The perfect wife. The perfect family. She sneered. But I was always in control. Not anymore. I shifted my weight, subtly signaling Mark. Then I made my move. I lunged forward, gun raised. Emma fired. But she missed. Mark's shot rang out, hitting her square in the shoulder. She screamed, dropping the gun. I tackled her to the ground, fists flying, years of rage and betrayal pouring out with every punch. She laughed through the blood. Too late, Jason, she gasped, her face twisted in pain. It's always been too late. I didn't stop until Mark pulled me off. Liam was safe. Shaking, crying, but safe. I held him, my tears mixing with his, as Emma's blood pooled beneath her, her breaths shallow. But she wasn't dead. Not yet. Emma's blood pooled beneath her, dark and sticky against the dirt floor of the cave. The bullet wound in her shoulder oozed steadily, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. But her eyes, those cold, emerald eyes, were still alive with something fierce. Not fear. Not regret. Satisfaction. She smiled through the pain, her teeth stained red, as if she'd won some twisted game only she understood. I held Liam tightly, his small body trembling against mine, his face buried in my chest. I could feel his heartbeat, fast, frantic, but he was alive. That was all that mattered. Mark knelt beside Emma, his gun still drawn, but she didn't flinch. She just lay there, her face a mask of defiance, blood seeping through her fingers as she weakly pressed them to the wound. You should have let me die, she rasped, her voice thin but laced with venom. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words tangled in my throat. The woman lying on the ground wasn't the Emma I married. She wasn't even the Emma who'd tried to poison me. She was something else entirely, stripped bare of all her masks, raw and unrecognizable. But I needed to know. I had to hear it. Why? The question escaped in a whisper, more breath than voice. Emma's smile widened, blood glistening on her lips. Why? she echoed, laughing softly, though it turned into a cough that sprayed crimson across her chin. Because you made it too easy, Jason. You believed in me. The perfect wife. The perfect family. It was pathetic. I felt Liam flinch in my arms, his sobs quieting as he listened, his small hands clutching my shirt like an anchor. I gave you everything, I whispered, my voice trembling, not with fear, but with fury. I trusted you. Emma's eyes darkened. That was your mistake. Mark pressed a cloth to her wound, trying to slow the bleeding, but she slapped his hand away weakly. Don't bother, she hissed. Let's just finish this. But I wasn't going to let her die without answers. Was it always like this? I asked, my voice cold now. From the start? Was any of it real? Her gaze met mine, sharp as glass. For a moment, something flickered there, something almost human. Real? She whispered, her voice softening. You want to know what was real? She coughed again, wincing from the pain. The control was real. Knowing I could mold you, shape you, make you believe you were in control when you never were. That was real. I clenched my fists, my jaw tightening until it ached. But Liam, I choked, glancing down at my son. Was he just part of the plan? For the first time, Emma hesitated. Her eyes flicked to Liam, and something shifted, just for a second. No, she whispered, her voice cracking. Not him. The words hit me harder than any betrayal. So you did feel something, I said quietly. She didn't respond, just stared at the ceiling of the cave, her breathing ragged. Mark's radio crackled, voices reporting their approach. Reinforcements were on the way. But none of that mattered. The war was already over. Emma turned her head slightly, meeting my gaze one last time. I never planned to love him, she murmured, her voice barely audible. But it happened. And I hated you for it. The words felt like knives, but not for the reasons she intended. It wasn't her hate that hurt. It was the fact that somewhere beneath all that darkness, there had been a sliver of humanity. A connection she couldn't deny, even as she tried to destroy it. Mark stood, shaking his head. She needs medical attention. But Emma laughed softly. Don't bother. I didn't move. Didn't speak. I just watched as the life slowly drained from her eyes. When the medics arrived, it was already too late. Emma was gone. But her shadow lingered. 3 months later. The house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence. Not the suffocating void Emma left behind, but a fragile piece, stitched together with the remnants of a life that had been torn apart. Liam was adjusting. Therapy helped. Time helped more. Kids are resilient in ways adults aren't. But I saw the shadows in his eyes, the questions he didn't ask, the memories he couldn't forget. I found myself staring at our old family photos one evening, the edges curling from years of neglect. Emma's smile was frozen in time, perfect and hollow. I thought about throwing them away, but I didn't. They weren't just reminders of her, they were reminders of me. The man I used to be. Mark visited often, checking in like the brother I never had. We didn't talk much about what happened. Some things don't need words. One evening, after Liam had gone to bed, Mark and I sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Do you ever think about her? He asked quietly. I sipped my beer, staring into the fading light. Every day, I admitted. Not because I miss her, but because she's a part of my story. And Liam's. Mark nodded, silent for a while. Then he said, You did what you had to do. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. And sometimes that's enough. Time doesn't heal all wounds. It just teaches you how to live with them. 3 months had passed since Emma died in that cave, her final breath tangled in lies and regret. But even now, her shadow lingered in every corner of my life, woven into the fabric of who I'd become. The house was quieter than I remembered. Not the peaceful quiet you'd expect after chaos, but the heavy, suffocating kind, the kind that reminded you something was missing, even if you weren't sure whether it was something you wanted back. Liam was doing better. Kids bounce back faster than adults, but the cracks were there if you knew where to look. He didn't talk about Emma. He didn't have to. The silence between us said enough. His nightmares had lessened, but some nights, I'd hear him call out in his sleep, his small voice fragile against the dark. I'd sit by his bed until he settled, whispering promises I wasn't sure I could keep. "You're safe now. I've got you." But safety was an illusion. The real question wasn't whether Emma was gone. It was whether the damage she left behind could ever truly disappear. One chilly morning, I stood in front of her grave. It wasn't marked with anything elaborate, just a simple stone etched with her name, the dates bookending a life lived in lies. No flowers. No heartfelt notes. Just dirt and regret. I hadn't been back since the funeral. Mark arranged it, a quiet affair with no speeches, no mourners. Just me, standing over the woman who tried to kill me, the mother of my child, the architect of my worst nightmares. I stared at the stone, feeling nothing and everything at the same time. "You almost won," I whispered. My voice sounded foreign, even to me. "But I'm still here." The wind picked up, rustling the dead leaves around my feet. It felt like the world was answering back, reminding me that survival wasn't the same as living. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye, a small envelope tucked beneath a rock beside the grave. No name. No address. Just there. I picked it up, my fingers trembling slightly. The paper was weathered, the edges damp from morning dew. Inside was a single piece of paper. "Check the safety deposit box." No signature. Just those words. My heart slammed against my ribs. I thought I knew everything, that Emma's secrets had been buried with her. But this note, it meant there was more. Something she left behind. I didn't hesitate. The bank was sterile, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly as I approached the teller. My hands felt too large, too clumsy, as I slid the old key across the counter. The woman barely glanced at me before nodding and disappearing into the vault. Minutes later, she returned with a small metal box. I took it to a private room, locking the door behind me. For a long moment, I just stared at it. My reflection wavered in the scratched metal, a distorted version of the man I used to be. Then I opened it. Inside were three things: a flash drive, a letter, a photograph. I picked up the letter first. "Jason, if you're reading this, it means I'm dead. Funny how that works, isn't it? Even in death, I still have the last word. You always thought you knew me. But you never really did. No one did. Not even me. I didn't love you. Not the way you wanted. But there were moments, brief flashes, where I almost did. Maybe that's why I'm leaving this for you. A piece of the puzzle you never figured out. The flash drive has everything. The accounts. The people who helped me. The money. But it's not just about me, Jason. It's about you. You think you're the victim in this story? But you're not. You were just as blind as I was ruthless. We both played our parts. I just played mine better. Don't pretend this was all me. You saw the cracks. You just chose to ignore them because it was easier than facing the truth. And the truth is, you needed me to be the villain. But I was never the only one. Goodbye, Jason. Emma. I read it 3 times, my hands shaking more with each pass. Was she right? Had I been blind because I wanted to be? Because it was easier to believe in the lie than confront the truth? I shoved the letter aside and picked up the photo. It was a picture of Emma and Mark. Together. Laughing. Not just a friendly laugh. Something more. Something intimate. My stomach twisted. I fumbled for the flash drive, plugging it into my laptop with trembling fingers. Folders popped up, financial records, emails, photos. Conversations between Emma and Mark. Dates lining up with moments when Mark had helped me. When he'd been there, always a step ahead. My mind spun, connecting dots I never thought to question. The late-night calls. The carefully timed advice. His sudden presence the night she was captured. It wasn't a coincidence. Mark had been part of it all along. I drove straight to his house, my knuckles white around the steering wheel, my heart pounding with betrayal hotter than anything Emma had ever made me feel. When he opened the door, he smiled like nothing had changed. But everything had. I didn't give him a chance to speak. My fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling to the floor. He scrambled back, holding up his hands. Jason, wait! Wait! For what? Another lie? Another twist in the knife? How long? I roared, my voice shaking the walls. How long were you in on it? His face crumpled, not with guilt, but with resignation. It wasn't supposed to go that far, he whispered. It was about the money. That's all. But she changed the plan. Changed the plan? Like I was just another detail in a blueprint. I didn't shoot him. I wanted to. But I didn't. Because killing him would have made me like them. Instead, I left. 6 months later. Liam and I moved to a small town, far from the ghosts of our past. A fresh start, or as close to one as we could get. I kept the photo. The letter. The flash drive. Not as reminders of betrayal, but as proof that survival isn't about erasing the past. It's about carrying it with you without letting it define you. Liam is thriving. His laughter is real again. And me? I'm still figuring it out. But one thing I know for sure. The past doesn't die. It just waits. And I'm done running. The end.